So welcome to this episode of Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities and gender equality. I'm Sandy Ruxton and I'm here with my co-host Stephen Burrell. Anything been happening in Australia, Stephen?
Hi Sandy, and hi everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we've just had a federal election here in Australia, which it's actually been quite a kind of positive and uplifting week, I'd say. For somebody who's new to Australia. So the Labour Party has won a huge majority here, which was a little bit unexpected, and I think you could certainly interpret that as being a kind of bit of a repudiation of kind of Trumpian politics, an embrace of climate action and renewable energy, and also the highest number of female MPs ever elected, I think, to the Australian Parliament. So it's quite exciting times here in Australia, really. Yeah, what about with you, Sandy?
Well, not so positive here. We see the advance of the sort of populist right and Nigel Farage's party. So that's only local elections, and people tend to use those as a protest, perhaps. But even so, there's some worrying trends here. But the other thing to report from here, actually, it's VE Day that we're recording on, Victory Europe Day. And so, I feel very conflicted about this in a way, because those of you who've listened to the podcast with Jackson Katz will know that, I lost an uncle in the Second World War just in the last couple of months. So, remembering those who've fallen, not just my family, but, those in other militaries and those civilians who died as well, is important to me. And yet around it, there's all this sort of paraphernalia of Great Britain somehow, and a tinge of militarism there as well, or perhaps more than that. So it's a strange day and a strange time, but also it's significant given the times that we're living through, and the threats to democracy and the rise of tyranny in different countries across the globe. It makes it so much more relevant and poignant. So anyway, that's what's going on here. But we should move on to today's conversation. Today's guest is also in Australia. She's Cordelia Fine, who's a colleague of yours at the University of Melbourne, Stephen, where she's a professor in the History and Philosophy of Science programme. Cordelia's new book, Patriarchy Inc, What We Get Wrong About Gender Equality and Why Men Still Win at Work, was listed as a non-fiction book to read this year by the UK Financial Times, and we'll be talking to her about it today. Her previous book, Testosterone Rex, won the Royal Society Science Book Prize, and Cordelia was awarded the prestigious 2018 Edinburgh Medal for her work challenging gender bias in science, and was recently named as a living legend by the Australian newspaper. So, hi Cordelia, we haven't had any living legend, well maybe we have actually on the podcast before, but welcome to Now and Men. We're delighted to have you on today's episode.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on the podcast. And still alive.
Well, that's good.
It's a start.
So, what can I ask you first, what was your motivation for writing Patriarchy Inc. and taking up the issue of the gendered division of labour, the higher pay, status and power that most men benefit from in comparison to women? Why is this such an important issue, and why now precisely?
Yeah, good question. So one thing I just find so fascinating about this topic is that we have this string of very familiar gender gap statistics, and we all, leadership, pay, etc., occupational segregation. There's not really much dispute about these statistics. But these same facts diagnose such different, they give rise to such radically different diagnoses of whether there actually is a problem, if there is a problem, what problem is it? Is it a problem for women? Is it a problem for men? And what, if anything, we should do about this problem. And to me, that's just really fascinating because, of course, it indicates that we're coming at these very same statistics with very different assumptions and worldviews and frameworks. And part of what I found really interesting about the book was drawing on, ideas from different disciplines and in academic disciplines to sort of get some insights into what are the kind of underlying assumptions that bring people to such different assumptions. But at a sort of more emotional level, I suppose, the book was inspired by the noble sensation of irritation, which is that, as you said, gender divisions of labour, whether it's, any kind of divisions of labour, they tend to be central to social hierarchies of status and power over resources. And, in addition to that, the work that people do, whether it's paid or unpaid, and what they get in return in societies, of course, has so much impact for so many dimensions of their well-being, whether it's, the capacity to use their knowledge and education in meaningful work, how much leisure time they have, how much control over their time they have, how much respect they're accorded, their social status, whether they have to make brutal trade-offs between paid work and caring for family. There's so economic security and everything that brings. There's so many facets of our well-being that are impacted by work. And yet so much of the mainstream discussion about gender equality and work has, in my view, been sort of sidetracked by these two very misleading or false narratives. So one is this kind of different, what I call the different but equal view, which is that actually, in countries like the UK, Australia, US, etc., it's not really that much of a problem still to solve. We've got different, men and women have different propensities, and the market just, gives fair returns on what people contribute to society. So you've got that kind of nothing to see here, we can move on point of view. And actually, when you look at some of the statistics on gender attitudes, that's actually quite a prevalent view, even if it's perhaps being spoken at more now than it was maybe a few months ago. But it's people do hold that view, and we can take it seriously. And then the second prominent view is what I call the business case, DEI, standing for diversity, equality, and inclusion, which is this, very familiar business case rationale that we hear in lots of, not just in the gender space, but in other areas too. But this idea that, achieving gender diversity in work, and note the shift from gender equality to gender diversity, achieving gender diversity in the work isn't just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do, because it gives organisation a competitive advantage. And so I thought, look, such an important issue because of all of the important goods and bads that work bring, and yet we've got these two wrong-headed ideas that were captured between. So I kind of wanted to perform an intervention on both.
I mean, you haven't said anything about your evidence for taking this perspective on these two notions. I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about that. I mean, there's plenty of evidence in your book, so it's actually hard to draw out the most relevant. But do you want to say anything about that? Yeah,
so maybe if I'll start with the different but equal perspective. So, as I mentioned, this is the idea that even though, of course, we still have quite marked gender gaps in who does what work and what they get in return, and I'm talking about both paid and unpaid work here, these arrangements reflect natural preferences, read evolved, biologically based, and fair market returns. And there was actually a really good example, so to speak, of this different but equal thinking that was published in The Australian not long ago. I think it would have been in March when the gender pay gap data in Australia came out. So it's an opinion piece by Janet Albrechtston, who was actually celebrating the gender pay gap as a happy reflection of fair market returns on women's and men's freely made choices about work and family. So from her point of view, this was, this is the economy working as it should. Men and women are segregating into the kinds of jobs that suit them, and the market is giving them a fair return. But of course, behind this perspective are some quite major assumptions about how both gender choices and wages, or the returns that we get, come about. So I critique both of those in the book. So maybe I start with there are problems with this assumption about being different and assumptions about us being equal. Apart from that, it's fine. So if we start with the different part, obviously for a long, I've been studying these ideas, these conceptions and assumptions about sex differences and brain and behaviour for a long time. And when it comes to the gender division of labour, it's true that this does seem to be, so far as we know, a universal feature across human societies. But particularly as social sciences have moved beyond the so-called weird economies or societies standing for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies and sort of started to do their research further afield, they've been gathering more and more evidence of cross-cultural diversity in how women and men think, feel and behave, and of course ethnographers for a long time have looked at cross-cultural and historical diversity in how gender is divided. And once you start to stack it all up, and I could go on relentlessly about this evidence, but there's a lot in there. But once you start to stack it all up, you can start to see that this diversity and this flexibility is really hard to square with the idea that our current contemporary gender division of labour is a legacy of sort of deep-rooted, biologically based, evolved sex differences in personality. And in fact, what I argue is that a major problem with this different but equal perspective is that it's actually drawing on the wrong evolutionary framework for understanding the evolution of human minds and social life. So this different but equal perspective often draws, often tacitly, on evolutionary psychology, which sort of assumes that we have these genetically inherited pre-installed mechanisms or modules in our head. But I think we actually are going to get a much more powerful explanatory framework if we look at cultural evolutionary perspectives on the human mind and social life. So these emphasize the importance of cultural evolution, of artifacts, skills, beliefs, and practices. It emphasizes the importance of cooperation and human evolution, and also social learning for understanding how we actually solve the problems of survival and reproduction. And in fact, the gender division of labour can be understood as, rather than the kind of legacy of evolved sex differences and predispositions, but as a culturally evolved practice. So I draw on the work of a philosopher of science called Caelan O'Connor, who argues that the gender division of labour, just because it's universal doesn't mean it's biologically based. In fact, she kind of uses mathematical modelling to argue that it's culturally evolved because societies that use sex to organise labour would have been more efficient and therefore better off than those that didn't, even when it comes to types of work where neither sex even has a physical advantage, right? So across societies, we do tend to see common patterns whereby, for example, kinds of work that involve a lot of upper body strength, for example, practically always are being done by men. The kinds of work that can be combined with pregnancy and breastfeeding strongly tend to be done by women. But there are many kinds of work where, in some societies, like building shelter, it's women's work, and other society it's men's work, right? So why have we evolved these kind of arbitrary but fixed patterns? She goes, well, because it's just efficient, right? Everyone knows who's going to do what, and it's a really efficient way of cooperating and coordinating. And this speaks to a kind of more general point that when it comes to generating adaptive behaviour, even in non-human animals, sex has more than one way of getting its work done. So often when we're thinking about, sex differentiated adaptive behaviour, we think, it must be inherited via the genes. And so there must be this direct route from genes to hormones to brain to behaviour. But even in non-human animals, there are these other routes. So sex, the biological, the genetic and hormonal components of sex also affect bodies, and those differences in the body, how they look, how they smell, and so on, they can affect the treatment by other individuals, other animals in the environment. And so, that's a kind of external or indirect route by which your brains or behaviour can be changed. And you can see that actually even in non-human animals. And of course, social experiences can affect genes and can affect hormones. We know, I think in humans, the most well-known examples of that actually come from testosterone. So the emphasis used to be on looking at how does testosterone drive behaviour. And then there was this realization, well, actually, there can be this reverse direction of causality where the way that you behave or the situation that you're in can actually change your testosterone levels, like parenting or nurturing or things like that. Mm-hmm. And then in humans, we have this sort of additional apparatus, which is our gender system, right? And so my argument in Patriarchy Inc. is that we tend to think of gender, the social construction of gender, as like something aside from evolution. my argument is actually this additional gender system apparatus, which is part of our cultural inheritance. It's not a sideshow. It's a culturally evolved adaptation for meeting the challenges of survival and reproduction. And the gender division of labour is just, one such example of a culturally evolved adaptation.
I love how in the book you talk about different examples of jobs and ask, well, how can we start to explain why, actually, obviously now in our society, we have incredibly complex, sophisticated divisions of labour, so for example, egg graders, how can we say that you're biologically predetermined to be an egg grader, for example? But yeah, I suppose, so then the second part of Sandy's question, I guess, was about this DEI approach, which you are kind of, as you already hinted at, quite critical of. So yeah, do you want to say more about that as well? Why you feel that approach is insufficient, and also what do you feel about how this DEI approach is kind of under attack at the moment, like in countries like the US, for example?
Yeah, so I think the reason that I worry about this idea that we're all getting fair returns on our work, I mean, I guess it won't be terribly surprising to many people, but we do tend to often are very much encouraged to think about these issues like the gender pay gap, for example, through the lens that's given to us by mainstream economics, which I just call that market thinking in the book. And this is the idea that, wages are determined by the sort of impartial, invisible hand of the market, and that will spit out the true price of a wage. And if the men are being overpaid or women are being underpaid, the employer will get punished, and the market, there'll be a correction through the market, through the mechanisms of supply and demand, so you'll reach this sort of fair equilibrium. But obviously economists' models, or the assumptions that they make, they're just idealizations. And I think I turned in the book to a theory from two sociologists, Dustin Avon-Holt and Donald Tomascovich-Devi, called relational inequality theory. And their point is, well, wages aren't actually determined. We don't sort of hand up the CV to the market and the market hands down the right wage, right? They're negotiated, between people in organizations, between industry leaders and governments and so on and so forth. And some groups and some industries just play with better cards in their hands when it comes to these negotiations. And this coupling between markets and what happens in firms is much weaker in life than it is in the economist models, and that leaves a huge amount of room for error and bias to become embedded in evaluations of productivity and skill. And there was actually just a really insightful example of that in Australia not so long ago, when there was a Fair Work Commission in 2024 into wages in the aged care sector. And they determined that, that is obviously a female-dominated occupation, and they determined that gender bias had meant that work was undervalued. And they actually traced that undervaluing right back to a legislation in 1907, which had legislated the breadwinner wage for, the typical husband and his wife and his 3 children, right? And so, in those days, it was seen as quite right that the man should earn more than a woman because he had these dependents to keep. And they argued that the wages of the aged care workers reflected a continuation of this history in which the skills of female-dominated occupations and industries were regarded as just women doing what comes naturally to them rather than actual skills. And it was really interesting because there'd been a fascinating qualitative interview study of the managers of residential and community aged care organisations. And they had been justifying the deprofessionalisation of this occupation. So they would refer to aged care as being skilled when the topic was about the quality of care, but as soon as it turned to wages, they would say, oh, well, it's the sort of nurturing that you can't really teach, right? So they had been justifying the low wages of this group, and it took the Fair Work. It wasn't the market that corrected things; it was the Fair Work Commission. So I think this, goes to show how closely you have to look at who's doing what and why they're getting what they get in return in order to actually create something that we can call equality. And that I think helps us understand why what I'm calling business case DEI doesn't necessarily get us very far. And so my caveat on this is, obviously I'm for diversity, equality and inclusion. In the book I use small d, small e, and small I when I'm referring to those concepts. And then I use the capitalization, the acronym DI, when I'm referring to specifically this kind of business case approach. You know, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And it's actually extraordinary how prominent the business case approach to DEI actually is. And, you know, there are several examples of that in my book, but one that came up recently, I just thought, I wonder what ChatGPT thinks about why gender equality matters. And, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, like most of the reasons that ChatGPT came up with were all to do with the business benefits of DEI. And look, I've got nothing against profitable, well-run organizations, you know, in principle. But at the most basic level, the most fundamental problem with this business case DI approach is that it de-emphasizes what most of us think is the reason to actually care about the equality and inclusion of women and other marginalized groups, which is that we want to create a fairer society. And, you know, there are a number of problems with this. I mean, one thing I think is actually it's been so dominant that in a way I feel like it's left us bereft of conceptual resources to sort of almost push back against these concerns about DEI. We sort of almost lost the language to talk about you know, why it's so important. I mean, this is just something that's been, you know, whirling in my head since the executive orders and everything that's followed from that. But, you know, one thing that's interesting about it is that, you know, even the intended beneficiaries of business case DEI actually seem to find it a bit off-putting. So there was and I often ask my students, you know, I give them two different diversity cases, one business case and one, you know, fairness. And I say, which organization would you rather work for? And, you know, the business case one, they're like, yuck. Right. And it turns out, well, they're not idiosyncratic in that, right? So there was a study looking at various, you know, LGBTQ workers or women working in STEM and racial minority groups. And, you know, they don't like this business case narrative. So, for example, in women, it triggers suspicions that they're going to be stereotyped, that they're going to be regarded as interchangeable with other women. You know, you have to make this kind of almost essentialist argument that women think in a particular way and that's why we need them. And or that they'll be exploited to make the company look good. So even the people that they're supposed to be welcoming to find the arguments a bit off-putting. But also these initiatives, they often just tend to be quite surface level. So, you know, one category of typical gender diversity DI initiatives are, you know, they've been dubbed Fix the Women. So let's send the women off to the leadership and development programs. Let's encourage them to lean in. Let's tell them how to use powerful body language and all these kinds of things. But, you know, that's as has been criticized much, you know, many times before by many people. That's not changing the conditions in which women are actually operating in. It's not doing anything to improve the low quality of female-dominated jobs. It's not trying to create more career ladders for part-time positions or improve the pay, for example. The sort of second category of initiatives has been dubbed Value the Feminine. So this is about, you know, saying, you know, being very enthusiastic about stereotypical feminine traits like empathy and collaboration and team building and things like this. And look, yes, of course, we should definitely value these kinds of stereotypical feminine traits. But, you know, one problem is that it can lead to some quite egregious gender stereotyping. And like some of the worst gender stereotyping I've seen is in these sort of business books making claims about, you know, why you need female brains because they're good at this and men's brains. You know, it's insulting to everyone, really. But also, you know, it's one thing to say that you value collaboration, but if you're in an organization where the people who get ahead are, you have to be ruthlessly competitive and risk-taking, it's not going to do any good, right? You actually have to do some really hard work to look at your policies and your practices and your norms and your reward systems to actually make sure that being collaborative, building teams is being properly rewarded. And that, you know, just to say, there are going to be some organizations where people are doing that hard work, but it's certainly not ubiquitous. Then, And then the third kind of initiative is called promoting equal opportunities. And, this, in principle, this is great. But again, if it doesn't go far enough, and it often doesn't, then it's not really going to help. So, for example, you can roll out flexible work policies, but if you don't change the underlying norms of the organisation, where there's this expectation of being constantly available and working really long hours, then that's just a recipe for either women kind of... Hee Jung Chung puts this really nicely in her book, The Flexibility Paradox. It's just a way of enabling women to have their full-time work and then fit that in flexibly around their second shift, right? There's no sort of accommodating the fact that people, everyone has work outside of, has things to do and family and responsibilities outside of their paid work. So if you're not really changing the organisation in a way to recognise that, people don't have stay-at-home wives at home, or not many people do, then you're not really going to help women who do still do more of the unpaid caring on average. And I think the third problem of this reframing of gender equality as being about increasing competitive advantage and increasing profits and so on is that it really lets organisations off the hook. I mean, it's just giving them license to only care about their profits and not necessarily think about other obligations that they might have to workers. And it means that the kinds of reforms that would help gender equality, but that wouldn't necessarily increase profits or might even push costs or risks back onto the employer, like more secure work or less greedy jobs or better wages for part-time workers, those are kind of off the table because they're not going to enhance profits unless you can make the business case argument for it.
And you provide an alternative account of the kind of gender system and how it works and what we should do about it, which, as the name of your book suggests, you call Patriarchy Inc. So yeah, could you just say a little bit about what you mean by that, and what this approach you're kind of advocating for adds to our understanding of this problem?
What I wanted to offer to people in Patriarchy Inc. was really three things. So practically, I wanted to try and give readers kind of concrete examples of how Patriarchy Inc. operates, by which I mean the sort of social and cultural forces that sustain these gender inequalities and who does what work and what they get in return, because we're not really likely to be able to make that much progress in fixing gender inequalities until we have a good understanding of how and why they come about. And I think often, we can talk about structural inequalities and things like that, but that's a very abstract notion, and what I wanted to do was try and make it a bit more concrete. So there are lots of examples in the book of very sort of quite detail specific, like this is the very this is the norm and this is how it creates inequality, and that can be quite challenging if you're someone who's thinking, how can I make my workplace better, because there isn't some kind of magic solution you can do. It is just sort of thinking really carefully about how work is done in your organisation and the values and assumptions. And that they might be quite different in different kinds of organisations, even organisations within the same industry. So it does require quite a lot of sort of thought and reflection. But I wanted to give people examples so they could sort of see it in action, as opposed to these abstract concepts of structural inequality and so on. So that's the sort of practical thing. Then there's this scientific idea. So, as I mentioned before, there's often this assumption that if you're trading in this idea that gender relations, or, gender disparities are socially created or socially constructed, right? Then you're a blank slatist. You think that our minds are just blank slates, and it kind of means that it's thrown out as an accusation that says you don't really believe in evolution, you don't believe in biology, right? And I wanted to show in an accessible way, actually, there are quite a few different theories of the evolution of the human mind. The one that people are most familiar with because of popularization is not necessarily the most plausible or helpful theory. Here are some other ideas for thinking about our evolutionary history and the implications for today, and to show why to think of ourselves as sort of evolved gender constructionists. We've evolved to construct social roles like gender roles. That's not kind of evolution denying, right? So that was the sort of scientific contribution that I wanted to make. And then the third was to really push back against this relentless business case narrative, and to sort of revive the concept of gender equality, because it's a term that we might use quite a lot, but we may have completely different meanings when we talk about gender equality, you know, from the fact that some people look at the current situation and go, yeah, nailed it, we've got gender equality. Some people look at it and go, well, now it's men and boys who are disadvantaged. And some people are like, no, we've still got a long way. Men are still, you know, they've got the status, the power. It's women and girls who are underneath. And I wanted to find a way of thinking about gender equality that could sort of bring everyone into the fold and we could all get behind it. And then I found this account from Ingrid Robbins, who's a political philosopher, which I thought was a really helpful way. It's a kind of multi-dimensional way of thinking about gender equality. So, you know, when you're thinking about what counts as being a kind of gender just situation, you've got your metric, so what you're measuring, and for her, it's not just, you know, wages or leadership positions or things like that. It's this whole multi-dimensional facets of well-being, you know, things that make up a good life in a post-industrial society. And as she points out, you know, there are some of these facets where men are doing better than women on average, but there are other aspects where, you know, it seems like men are doing worse than women. Like it might be, you know, the dangerous workplaces and workplace fatalities, for example, or men there being bigger barriers for men actually taking time off to care at home or take their paternity leave, or, you know, the stigma for men of doing that. So that's the metric. And then, you know, the principles of first of all, that these gender norms shouldn't make it harder to achieve any of these aspects of well-being, you know, shouldn't matter. So we need to work on the institutions, our interactions, and the way that gender influences our self-conceptions to try and eliminate those effects of those gender norms. And then the third principle is just that we're all making our contributions to society, and we should be getting fair returns, and it shouldn't be biased in just because, you know, things that women happen to do shouldn't be undervalued relative to things that men happen to do, or vice versa. And, you know, it seems to me that all these warring parties in the battle of the sex differences, you know, most people should be able to get behind. People who care about boys and men can get behind it. People who care about girls and women can get behind it. Difference feminists whose main concern is that we're undervaluing feminine roles, they can get behind it. People who are skeptical of my view about that we're actually, you know, not that different after all, they can get behind it, because it's about ensuring these gender norms aren't channeling people into into these sort of gendered roles. But just to remind us all, gender equality, you know, it's actually really important. It's not just about shareholder value. So let's remember how important work is for all of these things that we should really care about and make such an impact in people's lives.
In your conclusion, you make some suggestions for creating a more just society, you know, genuinely committed to diversity, equality, inclusion, rather than the DEI approach of fixing women or, you know, valuing the feminine or whatever. But I wondered if you wanted to outline some of the proposals you think are particularly important in this regard, and why they're needed.
Yeah, look, so I did, in a sense, gesture at a very high level at the kinds of things that we need to do, and it's a gargantuan task. So I remember there was a certain point in the book I was like, I can see why people just say unconscious bias training, because it would be so appealing if you could just say, here, I've got the solution to your problem, as opposed to the rather difficult things that I think are probably more necessary. So one aspect of it was that, you know, understandably, when we're talking about gender equality at work, we're kind of thinking about what happens to people when they're in adulthood and they're coming into the workplace and they've already made their decisions about education and career and so on. And but, you know, I think there's a sense in which it feels like we've, you know, our childhood has become more gendered in the past decades than it was when I was a child. And this is, you know, quite a common observation, that the thing of childhood culture of toys and clothing and all these kinds of things has become incredibly gendered. So there's this sort of weird contradiction where we say we're all for gender equality now, and it doesn't matter whether you're a boy or a girl, you can do anything, and yet at the same time we have this sort of, oh, but here are the pink toys and here are the blue toys, and don't wear that clothing because that's pink, and don't wear that because it's, you know, got Spider-Man on it, or whatever it might be. So, you know, there's this very relentless gendering of childhood, and, you know, we just need to be aware of that and how it is shaping children from an early age, instead of just sort of throwing our hands up in the air and saying, oh, well, boys will be boys. But then in terms of, to go from that sort of level up to the next level in terms of workplaces, I think, as I mentioned before, this is what this sort of difficult work of, you know, looking at organizations and thinking about how things are done that is creating inequality without anyone even realizing it. So one example is in the financial industry, there are some people, they have very large gender pay gaps, and they also have very large bonuses and very large you know, take home pay. And this French sociologist called Olivier Godichaux, he spent a lot of time studying French banks, and, you know, he was looking at the quantitative data, and he was doing sort of ethnographic studies and talking to people. And when he was asking you know, why are these finance professionals bringing home such enormous pay? And they would get these sort of the kinds of explanations that we get to explain the gender pay gap. Well, it's their human capital, they work very hard, you know, it's they're being rewarded for their productivity. But when he looked at what's going on, you know, these kind of market logics didn't really explain the kind of take-home pay that they were getting. So they get enormous bonuses, even when the profit was mostly to do with changes in the global economy, which of course individual financial professionals have, you know, I can't take any credit for that, right? And he found, you know, for example, you found that part of the reason that some people get very large bonuses was because they sort of exerted this de facto ownership over products or clients, and then they would use that as a kind of bargaining chip in these endless negotiations over their bonuses. And so that was a way in which it, you know, this is again, you know, these wages and bonuses aren't being handed down from this impartial market. It's a really good example of how they're just being negotiated through bunches of people. And part of the reason that they were able to do that was because they could exert this sort of ownership, so to speak, over clients and products and so on. And this is one thing that damages gender equality in pay for women, because this was a Norwegian study this time, which found that when women who work in these male-dominated parts of the financial sector, like investment banking and global commerce and so on, if they took maternity leave, they would often lose their clients because they would be away for such a period of time that they'd have to hand them over, and then they would rarely get them back again. And it's those clients that they needed to get the good bonuses and to get the career advancement, whereas the men would take paternity leave in ways that suited the organization rather than their family. So they might take it in the afternoons or in the summer period when it was quiet, and so they could cling on to their clients even if they were taking paternity leave. And, you know, one of the interviewees in this study said, look, we don't have to do it like this. We could actually have a collectivist approach to the clients. Nobody could own the client, but everyone could serve the client. And that would mean, actually, if you get, as his example was, if you get run over by a bus, it's okay. Someone can still take care of the client. And it's just a really nice example of how, you know, here's this assumption, constantly available, never take any time off, never get sick, never take leave, you know, nothing. That's how you get ahead. Okay, that's a very gendered assumption, obviously, and it's you know, it's harming women's equality with men, but it's also not great for men. It's not great for being human, right? To never be able to take your foot off the wheel or get ill or have an aging parent who needs assistance or anything like that, right? So that's just like, it's a very detailed example, but it's you know, it just goes to show how many assumptions can be built into the way that work is done, and how that results in inequalities in who gets what. But then, of course, you know, why does the finance industry, why do they earn so much money in the finance industry? Well, that's a very big economic question about the rise of finance and the sort of capturing of wealth by that particular sector. And so, obviously, this is one of the things that I find frustrating about the business case argument when it's applied to, if we only had more women, in paid employment, we would expand GDP. Okay, so first of all, it's overlooking all of the unpaid contributions to the economy through unpaid, care and domestic work that women do more to a greater extent than men. But it's also not paying attention to how that wealth is distributed within the economy. It's not just a simple case of bigger is better. It's also like, how is it being distributed? So one of the things that obviously that's a huge question. I don't have a 3-point plan for, rearranging the global economy, but, the general point was thinking about arranging workplaces and economies in ways that don't screw the people who stay at home and do the caring. This comes back to this sort of second wave feminist work. How do we move our workplaces and economy in a way that doesn't marginalize women? Are we all just going to work like men? Not sure about that. Do we try and compensate women more generously for the caring work that they do? There's some disadvantages of that. And I'm inclined to favor this idea of what Nancy Fraser called the universal caregiver, and just, let's create workplaces that assume that people will have other things in their lives at different points, sometimes more intensively than others, that we'll have to attend to, and not disproportionately punish people for not behaving like the ideal worker who's got someone at home to take care of the family and the home. And there are things that you can do in workplaces to try and facilitate that, and I think some organizations have put a lot of work into doing that. So one thing I should say is I'm not, I'm quite critical of some aspects of DEI, but I do know there's some really good work of that kind going on in some organizations. It's not all of a piece, but also thinking about policy levers that can move us further away from that old breadwinner homemaker model that we're still stuck in to some extent in practice, if not in principle.
So given this is a podcast about masculinity issues, we wanted to ask you, Cordelia, as well about your earlier book, Testosterone Rex. So in that book, you challenge the kind of powerful myth that men and women have evolved fundamentally different natures, and that testosterone is responsible for hardwiring male brains to, for example, take risks and compete. And so this got me thinking about how, in recent years in the UK and Australia and many countries, there's been really widespread conversations about, men's violence against women and how to prevent that. And actually, even in my own research, even with young people, you still often hear this view, that, well, men are just naturally more violent and aggressive than women. So there's only so much we can do to actually prevent this violence. So I was just wondering how you would respond to a kind of argument like that. And why do you think those kind of, these gender myths that we have about things like violence as being hardwired in men are so hard to shift, I suppose?
Yeah. So there's this really familiar story, isn't there, that men have evolved to be violent because ancestral men with a propensity for violence were more likely to successfully reproduce. So the idea is either that you're kind of competing for status and resources which are attractive to females, or you're sort of competing for access to females. And so this propensity for violence is then genetically inherited via sex biology. So, genes producing male typical levels of testosterone exposure. And, advocates of this point of view, first of all, point out that this male skew in physical aggression / violence is sort of universal. You see it everywhere. And they also draw comparisons with other animals, like red deer, or elephant seals are popular examples, where you have males sort of ferociously fighting each other for access to females. So, it's a familiar story, and it has a kind of certain intuitive plausibility to it. But there are quite a few assumptions built into it. So, one of the things I wanted to do in Testosterone Rex, although I wasn't specifically focused on violence per se, more sort of risk-taking and status-seeking and competition in general, I did want to take a closer look at a lot of the assumptions behind this sort of narrative. And, one of the reasons that I didn't look at serious violence, which is the one, the difference where you have the largest and most consistent difference between males and females. And that's worth pointing out because there was actually, I mentioned earlier about research in the behavioural sciences, starting to move beyond the usual samples from Western Europe and North America and so on to other places. And there was a review recently of data from low and middle income countries looking at same-sex physical aggression in adolescence. And in most of the countries, males are more likely to be physically aggressive than females. There was actually a huge range, I should say. But there were about 4 countries where there was effectively no difference, which was kind of interesting. And it, not that many, but still challenging this idea that the difference is universal. So that's interesting in itself. But when you're looking at serious violence, it is universal across sort of human societies in existence today. But, that we can ask the question, like, was it really the case that men with a propensity for serious violence were consistently the most reproductively successful? I mean, this comes back to our underlying assumptions about, human nature. Is it, competitive and fighting? I mean, we're also this highly cooperative species. We depend on cooperating with each other to survive and to reproduce. And in fact, some people have even suggested that the reason that humans are quite unusual as primates in having paternal care is that maybe females actually preferred to mate with males who were good babysitters, and this kind of this preference like ratcheted up over time, resulting in the evolution of paternal care. That's a quite different story to the idea that the females are sitting around waiting to see which of the most male is the most violent, right? Actually in this story he's like, babysitting. Okay, that's quite a different story. We don't have a time machine to go back and find out, right? So that's an assumption, right? Second, even if it was the case, as I mentioned before, adaptations aren't necessarily inherited via the genes. We've got this cultural apparatus. It could just be that, it's like being the physically aggressive ones, that's like part of the division of labor. And, as with any other social role, we enforce it through identities, through norms, through learning, right? And if you've got one sex that's physically stronger in upper body strength than the other, it's not maybe surprising that they're the ones who tend to be the ones who would be sent out for fighting or to be the specialists in physical aggression. So it may well have been adaptive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's passed on via the genes. It can be inherited through kind of cultural inheritance. A second thing to say about, blaming the testosterone is, even though we think of physical aggression and serious violence as male traits because most people who are violent in those ways are male, of course most men, not all men, like in Sweden, 96% of men are not convicted of a serious crime, violent crime. But they've all got male typical testosterone. So this points to, where does testosterone come in terms of an explanatory factor? There are obviously factors other than testosterone that we need to help us explain why a man heads down a sort of trajectory of violence. And these are, lots of these things will be things that we can intervene on. The third thing is that although there's this really strong cultural link in our minds between testosterone and male violence, even though scientists have been looking for decades, it's actually extraordinary how inconsistent or lacking in clear evidence links between the two actually are. So, sex differences in physical aggression don't increase at puberty, which you would expect, because that's the time when testosterone increases a lot in males. So if testosterone is facilitating physical aggression in males, we'd expect to see the sex difference getting bigger at that point. There was a longitudinal study that was following boys as they passed from prepubescence into pubescence and looking at their hormones and looking at their physical aggression. They didn't find any evidence that as, in individual boys, as their testosterone was rising, they were more likely to become physically aggressive. And experimental studies that administer exogenous testosterone to men don't find that it increases their aggressiveness. So it's interesting how the confidence with which we link the hormone with the behaviour is sort of belied by the weakness of the evidence. Rebecca Jordan-Young and Katrina Karkazis have described the linking of testosterone and male violence as a zombie fact. It just rises again and again, despite the weakness of the evidence.
Something I took some hope from reading your book, Cordelia, was about I think you showed really well that the way that we've currently organised things just doesn't really work for anyone, right? That actually there's lots and lots of men who are fathers, who want to be a lot more involved in childcare than they actually are able to be currently, and lots of children who want to spend more time with their dads, So I thought that was really nice, that it shows that actually this isn't working for any of us, and I feel like there's possibilities for change there, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there was a paper that I came across that made a point that really struck me, was that, industrialization, there was such a major shift for fathers, leaving the household and going out to work, and the next revolution be for the fathers to come back home, and so long as that work is punished economically and socially, it's going to be very hard to encourage more of that, more active involvement of fathers and so on. But there does seem to be an appetite for it, which is really great to see. So we just need the workplaces and the economy to support that.
One of the things I found really attractive about your writing is just the humour you bring to it. And in all your books, actually, there's glimpses of your family life which are very witty. And, just to give one example, I'll leave people to read the book to find others. But when your younger son in Testosterone Rex asks you whether to use the word sex or gender in an assignment, and, faced with a possible sermon with you, he just exclaims, "Well, just tell me which it is, Mum. Is it sex or is it gender?" And I just think those humorous touches are very attractive and engaging as well. And, it can be hard reading through scientific and psychological evidence and papers in your work. But I'd really recommend people to read your book, for the humour in it as well. So I just wanted to ask, though, where does that humour come from, really? I mean, I know your mother is a writer as well, isn't she? And so I'm wondering whether there's a sort of storyteller in there in you, as well as a psychologist, scientist.
Oh, well, yeah. Thank you for the lovely compliment. Yeah, my mother is, she writes children's books. Well, she's written some books for fiction for adult, but she's mostly known for her children's books, and they are so funny books.
Exactly.
So,
well, exactly. I wondered about that. I've read some of them as well. So I thought they're great.
They're fantastic, and I enjoyed reading them when I was a child, and then I really enjoyed reading them again when my children were younger and that at that age. So, perhaps some of that's rubbed off on me, but yeah, I think yes, it can be. I often feel like you have to give people a bit of a reward for reading a book about gender. Maybe is that how I feel? But I'm not sitting at my desk roaring with laughter every word I write. Sometimes there's this very funny cartoon of a writer sort of she types something and she goes, that's funny, and she sits there, is it funny? It seemed funny. No, it's funny. No, it's definitely funny. Oh, but is it? and then they have the reader going, and that's kind of what it's like for me, sort of you working on the joke and getting your readers can have very strong opinions on when you send early drafts of the jokes. So you send it to an expert for their, to make sure you've got some aspect of the theory or the evidence right, and they will also offer their opinions on your joke. So one of them said, I'm not sure this joke is worthy of you, or something like that. And I thought, no, I like that joke. I even had a footnote saying that someone had. Yeah. So anyway, yes, it's good to. Feminists have a great sense of humour, so I just want to reassert fulfill the stereotype of the humourful feminist. So, but thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I was wondering as well, Cordelia, what led you into this kind of work in the first place? What led you to want to kind of look at the science of gender? Did you already have that kind of feminist stance, and then you wanted to apply that in this context, or yeah?
Not really, actually. So, no, I was actually began as an anti-feminist. No, that's not right. No, I was working in moral philosophy and moral psychology, and after my PhD at Monash University, I was in the School of Philosophy and Bioethics, and the way I came into the issues of sex and gender was actually as a parent. So I was reading lots of parenting books, and somebody in my mother's group had recommended a book that was about why boys and girls' brains are different, and that's why we should parent them differently and educate them differently. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I had a look at it, and they were talking about brain scanning studies, and I was like, oh, that's interesting, particularly because they were mentioning parts of the brain that I had studied with my PhD, which was at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience. And so no one was talking about sex differences then, so I kind of looked up the study that was being used as evidence for why you should teach boys and girls maths differently, or whatever it was. And I was just sort of shocked at the disconnect between what the study showed and this popular claim, and that's really where I got hooked. And so I wanted to write a book, and then I started to look around, and I started to see all these other books, for business leaders, for parents, teachers, relationship books, right? And they were all drawing on these new neuroimaging technologies to say, this is why we can't understand each other, this is why you need women in the C-suite, all this sort of stuff. And I was shocked, because it was just these gender stereotypes sort of dressed up in neuroscientific finery, and there wasn't really scientific substance behind it. And so that's when I wanted to write. That's when I ended up writing Delusions of Gender. But the original targets for Delusions of Gender were just the popularizers. So I turned to the science to go, okay, now what do we know? And that's when I started to get very puzzled, because of some of the assumptions that were taking place and the methods that were being used in the science itself. And I remember at a certain point thinking, this is actually a much more complicated book than I thought it would be, because it's not just the popularizers that are that I need to criticize, but also the science itself. And so I ended up writing a more complex, more controversial, I suppose, book, but looking at the problems with the neuroscience, the hormone studies, and so on. So that's how I got into it. And I think sometimes people assume that I've been studying Judith Butler as my Bible for decades, just waiting to take down the scientific patriarchy. But yeah, I really fell into it, and I was totally open to the idea of there being sex differences in the brain that were created by hormonal influences. I just didn't think it should be exaggerated, and that we should be talking in these very stereotypical ways. But I was, as I said, I was quite surprised by the science itself, and I started to present to humanities scholars, and they would be politely stifling a yawn, and I said, oh, sexist assumptions have found their way into science, and they're like, tell us, surprise me, but to me it was naively it was a bit of a shocking revelation. So that's how I got into it.
You must have waded your way through an absolute ton of popular, fairly rubbish books in your in your time.
I have, and
I'm amazed you did that, but I'm so grateful that you have, for us
absolutely.
and for our listeners and your readers and so on.
It was a great
It's been fascinating to hear.
I'm glad you appreciate it. Yeah.
It's been fascinating to hear you talk today, and I'm just really grateful for the work that you do and for talking to us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh no, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening, having me on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Stephen, there was so much information in that conversation we just had with Cordelia, and so many great examples. I've just wondered what reflections you had on what she had to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so impressive, isn't it? Cordelia's knowledge and, the ways that she's able to analyse and critique things in inaccessible but also still complex ways. It's incredibly impressive and humbling, really. And I also thought she was very humble about her own knowledge and contribution. But yeah, I mean, one thing which I guess I can't help but think about, the fact that her book does talk about work around diversity, equity and inclusion, and the kind of limitations of how that work has been done, which I think are really valid critiques, aren't they, about how it's become often basically a way of helping businesses make more money and make workplaces more efficient. But obviously now we are seeing DEI under attack, and maybe it's easy to attack it, right, because it hasn't necessarily made a big difference to people's lives in the way that it really should, right? It should create workplaces which are more positive for everybody. It should be reducing inequality and marginalisation, and it hasn't necessarily achieved that anywhere near enough. Even though, as Cordelia did recognise, didn't she, that there are important elements of DEI work and there have been good achievements made. But I do think that her fundamental point is really important, though, isn't it? That I guess when we're so desperate to make the case for why workplaces should be kind of taking equality seriously, I think we do kind of go on that slippery slope, don't we, of like why it benefits them. And actually I think that's something which applies for kind of social justice work more broadly. Certainly when we're trying to engage with men and boys about gender equality, we're very quick to emphasize like the benefits and why it's in your own self-interest, which of course is true, but at the same time, I think she's right that fundamentally we should be doing this because it's the right thing to do, right? And I think that is the only thing really which will motivate us to take the action which is necessary, that it's an ethical imperative. It's not just about self-interest, it's about the fact that we want to live in a better world, and that's what should be motivating us. What did you think?
I was interested thinking about, to what extent we've made progress and to what extent we might be going backwards. I suppose I'm partly motivated by reading something by Rebecca Solnit recently, where she talks about progress as what she calls uneven terrain. That you make some advances, but also you can go backwards at the same time. And the example I was thinking about was when I used to work in a children's organisation in the 1980s, 1990s, and I remember distinctly that in Save the Children in the UK, there was a job evaluation scheme that specifically valued quite highly traditionally low-paid work, often mainly done by women, and that was promoted by the recognised trade union at the time. And we tried to, we were thinking about trying to do the same in the organisation I was working for. And, I suppose, well, one thing in there is the role of trade unions, which I don't think she mentioned very much, but seems to me to be significant and how that's declined. But also it feels like, and I'm not so much in the workplace these days, but it feels like very often when someone is offered a job, they basically quite often negotiate their own salary when they do that. It's not as if there is a salary pertaining to that job. And of course, we know that men are particularly bullish about promoting their own skills and talents and perhaps better at negotiating, I say better, more successful in negotiating higher salaries for themselves. So there's a gender point in there as well. And so, in a way, it's an example which both looks backwards and forwards at the same time.
Yeah, and I think Cordelia talks about, doesn't she, how that was one thing which touched me in the book about how yes, in recent decades there is more embracing of men playing a role as active fathers, but at the same time, because we've got this kind of neoliberal capitalism now being so influential, so many people are in very precarious jobs. They're very insecure, so they're having to work harder than ever to keep the work that they've got and to prove their worth to their employer. So even though there is this discourse about involved fatherhood, it's still, incredibly difficult for men to feel able to say, actually, I'm only going to work 9 to 5 because I actually really prioritize my family time. Which again shows, as you said, that kind of both positive and backwards movement, I suppose.
And the very important point about the relationship between your working life and your life outside work in terms of care. And we know that people like Lynn Seagal have worked with a Care Collective on this about a more sort of prominent notion of care being highly important and generally undervalued. So,
and that was one of Cordelia's key kind of recommendations, as it were, wasn't it? Was to value care more. And one thing which struck me about the book really is the fundamental importance throughout human history of cooperation, to our survival and our flourishing. And even within capitalism, like where we often talk about it as being about competition and individuals, actually the whole capitalist system would fall apart if we weren't constantly cooperating with each other in quite complex and sophisticated ways. So, yeah, it's a fascinating read. I would encourage our listeners to check it out.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, thank you, everyone, as always, for listening. Do subscribe to Now and Men wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already, and please do share it with your friends or family and colleagues. And we'll be back with another episode soon.
Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Bye.